The Wilsons had always been the kind of family other people envied. From the outside, they seemed perfect. David and Margaret, married for 35 years with their 3 successful adult children: James, the attorney; Sarah, the doctor; and Michael, the entrepreneur. Their colonial-style house in Westbridge, Connecticut had hosted countless Christmas dinners, summer barbecues, and family gatherings that reinforced their image as the ideal American family. But families rarely reveal their true selves to the world, and the Wilsons were no exception. It was Sarah who found the letter, tucked inside an old book she'd borrowed from her father's study. She hadn't meant to pry. She'd only wanted to read the classic novel her father had recommended. The yellowed envelope fell out as she turned to the first chapter, landing silently on her lap. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, but the date, March 1988, caught her attention. She was born in 1989. Sarah stared at the envelope for several minutes, knowing she should simply return it unread. But something about the way it had been hidden, pressed between pages that likely hadn't been opened in years, made her fingers tremble as she carefully extracted the letter inside. "My dearest David," it began. "I don't know how to write this letter, but I must. What happened between us wasn't a mistake to me, but I understand your decision to stay with your family. I've respected your wishes and kept my distance. But now I need to tell you that you have a son. His name is Thomas, and he's beautiful. He has your eyes." Sarah stopped reading, her heart pounding in her chest. Her father had another child, a son born just before her? It couldn't be true. Her parents had been married since 1984. This would mean her father had been unfaithful just 4 years into their marriage, while her mother was pregnant with James. She couldn't process it. David Wilson was a pillar of honesty in their community, a man who served on the school board, coached Little League, and lectured his children endlessly about integrity. This revelation felt like finding out the earth was flat after all. For 3 days, Sarah carried the secret like a stone in her stomach. She avoided her parents' calls, claiming work kept her busy. She barely slept. On the 4th day, she called her brothers. "We need to talk. It's about Dad. Can you both come to my place tonight?" James arrived first, his face creased with worry. At 36, he was the oldest and had always taken his role as big brother seriously. His tie was still tied around his neck despite the late hour. He'd come straight from the law firm. "What's going on, Sarah? You sounded strange on the phone." "Let's wait for Michael," she replied, pacing her apartment. Michael arrived 20 minutes later, breathless from jogging up the stairs. At 31, he was the youngest and most carefree of the siblings, having made his fortune early with a tech startup he'd sold 2 years ago. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was terrible," he said, dropping into Sarah's armchair. "So what's this about, Dad? Is he sick?" Sarah took a deep breath and handed them the letter. She watched their expressions change as they read. James's face hardening into stone, Michael's eyes widening in disbelief. "Where did you find this?" James finally asked, his voice unnaturally controlled. "In his copy of The Great Gatsby. It fell out when I opened it." "This doesn't prove anything," Michael said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It could be, I don't know, fiction? A joke, a joke," Sarah replied. "Hidden in a book for 30 years? James read the letter again, his attorney's mind already calculating dates and scenarios. If this is true, this Thomas would be 37 now, a year older than me. The silence that followed was heavy with shared thought. They might have a brother they'd never known about. "We need to talk to Dad," Sarah finally said. "And say what?" Michael asked. "Hey Dad, we found your old love letter. Do we have a secret brother?" "Come on. Then what do you suggest?" Sarah snapped. "We pretend we never saw it. We just carry on like normal." James, always the mediator, raised his hands. "We need to be careful here. This could tear the family apart." "The family?" Sarah's voice rose. "If this is true, Dad already tore the family apart 37 years ago." The siblings argued late into the night. James wanted caution, to investigate privately before confronting their father. Michael suggested they forget the whole thing. What good would come from digging up ancient history? Sarah insisted on confrontation. The deception was ongoing as long as they all pretended not to know. They parted without resolution, each returning to their own homes with copies of the letter weighing in their pockets. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. The image of this unknown half-brother, Thomas, kept appearing in her mind. Did he know about them? Had he grown up wondering about his father's other family? The thought made her angry all over again. By morning, she'd made her decision. She called in sick to the hospital where she worked and drove the 40 minutes to her parents' house without warning anyone, not even her brothers. Her mother answered the door, surprise flickering across her face. "Sarah, what a lovely surprise. Your father's just in his study." The mention of the study, where the book and letter had been hidden, made Sarah's resolve waver. But she straightened her shoulders and walked down the familiar hallway, knocking once before pushing open the heavy oak door. David Wilson looked up from his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, gray hair neatly combed as always. At 65, he remained handsome and distinguished. "Sarah, what brings you here on a Tuesday?" She pulled the letter from her bag and placed it on his desk. The color drained from his face as recognition dawned in his eyes. "I think we need to talk, Dad." For a moment, he looked as though he might deny knowing what it was. Then his shoulders slumped, and he suddenly looked every one of his 65 years. "Close the door," he said quietly. Sarah did, then stood waiting, arms crossed defensively across her chest. "Where did you find this?" His voice was hollow. "In your copy of Gatsby. Is it true? Do I have a brother named Thomas that you've hidden from us our entire lives?" David removed his glasses slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's complicated, Sarah. That's not an answer." He looked up at her, his eyes full of a sadness she'd never seen before. "Yes," he finally said. "Thomas exists. But there's more to the story than what's in that letter." Outside the study, Margaret Wilson paused by the door, a tray of coffee and cookies in her hands, listening to the conversation that was about to change everything. Margaret's hands shook as she set the tray down on the hallway table. She had prepared coffee and cookies automatically, a hostess reflex ingrained after decades of marriage. But the words drifting through the study door froze her in place. "Thomas." The letter. Her husband's confession. She pressed her palm against the wall to steady herself. After all these years, their carefully constructed life was crumbling like a sand castle against the incoming tide. Inside the study, Sarah stood rigid, watching her father's face crumple. "More to the story," she repeated. "Like what, Dad? What possible explanation could make abandoning your own child okay?" David gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit down. I'd rather stand." "Sarah, please. This isn't a conversation to have standing in doorways." Reluctantly, she lowered herself into the leather chair, perching on its edge. David took a deep breath. "It was 1987. Your mother and I were having difficulties. James was too, and we were struggling with parenthood, with money, with everything." He paused, running a hand through his gray hair. "We separated for 6 months. It wasn't public. We told everyone I was away on a work assignment. During that time, I met Rebecca, the woman who wrote the letter," Sarah supplied, her voice flat. "Yes, she was kind and understanding when I needed that most. We became involved, but your mother and I eventually reconciled. I ended things with Rebecca before she knew she was pregnant." The study door opened. Margaret stood there, her face pale but composed. "I think I should be part of this conversation." Sarah looked between her parents, comprehension dawning. "You know, Mom, you've known all this time." Margaret entered and closed the door firmly behind her. "Yes, I've known since Thomas was born. Rebecca contacted us." David nodded. "She wrote that letter first, and then called a few months later when Thomas was born." Sarah felt dizzy. "So both of you knew? All these years? And what? You just pretended he didn't exist?" Her parents exchanged a glance that spoke of years of shared secrets. "It's more complicated than that," Margaret said, sitting on the small sofa against the wall. "We made arrangements. Financial support. College tuition. You paid her off?" Sarah's voice rose incredulously. "No," David said sharply. "We supported my son. There's a difference. But you never told us about him. You never acknowledged him as family." Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. "That was Rebecca's decision, not ours. She didn't want Thomas to know about your father until he was an adult. She remarried when Thomas was 5, and her husband adopted him." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her entire understanding of her family was shifting beneath her feet. "Does Thomas know now? Does he know about us?" David nodded slowly. "We met him when he turned 18. He knows he has half-siblings." Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "You've met him? How many times?" "A few times over the years," David admitted. Birthday dinners, his college graduation. His wedding, Margaret added quietly. He has 2 children now. I have nieces or nephews I've never met. Sarah's voice broke. How could you keep this from us? How could you lie for our entire lives? We were protecting everyone, Margaret said. You children, Thomas, our family. It wasn't an easy decision. It wasn't your decision to make. Sarah shouted, then caught herself, lowering her voice. We deserve to know. He deserved to be part of our family. And what about James? David countered. What about you and Michael? Would knowing have made your childhoods better? Would dragging a confused child between 2 families have been fair to anyone? Sarah paced the study, trying to process everything. You should have told us when we were old enough to understand. We're all adults now. We have been for years. You're right, David said softly. We should have. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to find the right moment. We kept waiting for the perfect time. And now, Sarah demanded, were you ever going to tell us if I hadn't found that letter? Her parents' silence was answer enough. Sarah pulled out her phone. I'm calling my brothers. They need to hear this directly from you. Within an hour, James and Michael had arrived, their faces grim with the foreknowledge Sarah had given them by phone. The family gathered in the living room, a parody of the countless family meetings they'd had over the years. But this one was different. The Wilson family as they knew it was being redefined before their eyes. James, ever the lawyer, asked methodical questions about legal arrangements and financial support. Michael sat in stunned silence, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. Sarah watched her parents closely, seeing them as flawed humans rather than the idealized figures of her childhood. I want to meet him, she finally said, interrupting James's question about trust funds. The room fell silent. Thomas, she clarified, though everyone knew who she meant. I want to meet my brother. Me too, Michael said, speaking for the first time since arriving. James hesitated, then nodded. If he's willing, yes. David and Margaret exchanged glances. We can reach out to him, David said cautiously. But this will be a shock for him too. His relationship with us has always been limited. By design. Does he even know we exist? Michael asked. He knows, Margaret confirmed. But he's respected the boundaries we all established years ago. Boundaries you established, Sarah corrected. None of us had any say in this arrangement. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Decades of secrets and half-truths hung in the air between them. I'll call him tonight, David finally said. I can't promise anything, but I'll ask if he's willing to meet you. The revelation fractured the Wilson family in ways they couldn't have anticipated. In the weeks that followed, old resentments and new grievances bubbled to the surface. James threw himself into work, avoiding family gatherings with transparent excuses about case preparations. Michael swung between anger and philosophical acceptance, depending on the day and his mood. Sarah became the reluctant mediator, her medical training making her the most equipped to manage the emotional fallout. Margaret and David seemed to age years and weeks. The secret they'd carried for so long had been a weight, but sharing it hadn't brought the relief they might have hoped for. Instead, it had opened a chasm between them and their children. 1 month after Sarah found the letter, the Wilsons gathered again in the family home. This time, they'd been summoned by a text from David. Thomas has agreed to meet you. Sunday dinner, 5 p.m. Sarah arrived first, finding her mother in the kitchen, nervously preparing far too much food. Mom, take a breath, she said, gently taking a spoon from Margaret's trembling hand. It's going to be okay. Margaret smiled weakly. Is it? I've imagined this day for 37 years, and now that it's here, I'm terrified. The doorbell rang at precisely 5 o'clock. The Wilsons froze in their various positions around the house. Margaret in the kitchen, David halfway to the door, James straightening paintings that didn't need straightening, Michael pretending to check his phone, and Sarah standing in the center of the living room, heart pounding. David opened the door, and there he was. Thomas Baker stood on the doorstep, tall and lean with sandy brown hair and unmistakably Wilson eyes, the same clear blue that Sarah saw in the mirror every morning. Hello, he said simply. I'm Thomas. I think you've been waiting to meet me. Time seemed suspended as Thomas stood in the doorway of the Wilson home. His physical resemblance to the family was undeniable. James's height, Michael's lean build, Sarah's eyes. The shared DNA was evident in ways that made the decades of separation seem even more absurd. Please, come in, David finally said, stepping aside. Thomas entered the house with the careful movements of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. He carried a bottle of wine that he handed to David with a small nod. My wife suggested I shouldn't come empty-handed. That's very thoughtful, David replied awkwardly. Your wife? Is she? Emma's giving us this first meeting alone, Thomas explained. We thought it might be easier. The small talk dwindled into silence. The Wilsons stood arranged like mannequins in a department store display, no one knowing quite what to do next. Sarah was the first to break the paralysis. She stepped forward and extended her hand. I'm Sarah. I'm a doctor at Westbridge General. I found the letter. She hadn't meant to add that last part, but it tumbled out anyway. Thomas shook her hand. His grip was firm, but not overpowering. I know who you are. All of you. He glanced around the room. I've known for a long time. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. Dinner's ready whenever everyone is. They filed into the dining room where Margaret had set the table with the good china, the set usually reserved for Thanksgiving and Christmas. The formality of it struck Sarah as both touching and ridiculous. This wasn't a holiday. It was a reunion that should have happened decades ago. The initial conversation was painfully stilted. Weather, traffic, general comments about Westbridge. Nothing that acknowledged the elephant in the room. 37 years of deliberate separation. It was Michael who finally cut through the pretense, setting down his fork halfway through the main course. So, did you always know about us? Or was there some big dramatic revelation? James shot him a warning look, but Thomas seemed relieved at the direct question. I found out when I was 18, he said. My mother, Rebecca, told me just before I left for college. She thought I should know before I started my adult life. He took a sip of water. She gave me David's number and said it was my choice whether to make contact. And you did, Margaret said softly. Thomas nodded. I was curious. Wouldn't you be? No one answered. The question hung in the air between them. What do you do for work? James asked, steering towards safer ground. I teach high school English in Hartford, Thomas replied. Nothing as impressive as a lawyer, doctor, and tech entrepreneur. His tone wasn't bitter, just matter of fact. That's important work, Sarah said. More important than most of what we do. Thomas smiled slightly, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since arriving. My students would disagree. They think analyzing The Great Gatsby is cruel and unusual punishment. The irony of the book title, the same book that had hidden the fateful letter, wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Sarah caught her father's eye and saw him flinch slightly. You mentioned children? Margaret ventured. Thomas's face softened. 2. Ella is 8. And Ben is 5. He pulled out his phone and passed it around, showing pictures of 2 fair-haired children with wide smiles. They don't know about all of this yet. Emma and I thought we should see how this meeting goes first. Sarah stared at the photos, a lump forming in her throat. These children were her niece and nephew. They had existed for years without her knowledge. How many birthdays had passed? How many first steps and lost teeth and school plays had she missed? They're beautiful, she managed to say, passing the phone to Michael. They look like you did at that age, Margaret commented to Sarah, then immediately looked flustered. I mean, they have that same smile. Thomas reclaimed his phone, studying Margaret with newfound interest. You've seen my baby pictures? David cleared his throat. Rebecca sent some photos over the years. Before we met you. She never told me that, Thomas said quietly. The rest of dinner passed in a strange mix of awkward silences and bursts of carefully navigated conversation. They learned that Thomas had grown up comfortably in a Hartford suburb, that his adoptive father had been kind but distant, that he'd played baseball in high school, that he'd met his wife in college. Normal life details that should have been shared over years of family gatherings, compressed into a single meal. After dessert, David suggested they move to the living room for coffee. As the others filed out, Sarah hung back, catching Thomas alone in the dining room. I want you to know that I'm angry about all of this, she said quietly. Not at you, at them. At the situation. We should have known each other our whole lives. Thomas studied her face. I used to think that too. But then I had my own children, and I realized how complicated parenting can be. How you make decisions thinking you're protecting your kids, even if those decisions might seem wrong to someone else. Are you defending them? No, he said, just acknowledging that there's no instruction manual for any of this. Everyone was trying to do what seemed right at the time. Sarah sighed. When did you get so wise? You're supposed to be as angry and confused as the rest of us." A small smile tugged at his lips. Teaching teenagers teaches you perspective and patience. In the living room, the conversation gradually became less forced. Michael asked about Thomas's teaching, genuinely interested in his approach to engaging reluctant students with literature. James, ever practical, raised questions about Thomas's children's education funds, already thinking like a protective uncle. Margaret shared family stories that included embarrassing childhood moments for all three of her children, trying in her way to give Thomas a glimpse of what he'd missed. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself studying Thomas, trying to reconcile this stranger with the idea of a brother. He had her father's mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when listening, how he absent-mindedly straightened his silverware. But there was something of his mother in him too, something she couldn't quite identify having never met Rebecca. "What happens now?" Sarah finally asked during a lull in conversation. "Is this a one-time thing, or are we actually going to try to be a family?" The room fell silent. It was the question they'd all been avoiding. Thomas set down his coffee cup. "I came here tonight because I've always wondered what it would be like to know you all properly. Not just as names and occasional stories, but as people." He looked around the room. "I have a good life. A complete life. I'm not looking to fill some void or suddenly create the brother-sister relationship we never had. But I am open to seeing what kind of relationship might be possible now." "I'd like that," Michael said immediately. James nodded his agreement, though more reserved. "Me too," Sarah added. "And I'd like to meet your children sometime, if that's okay." Thomas smiled. "Ella would love that. She's going through a doctor phase right now. Wants to perform surgery on all her stuffed animals." The tension in the room dissipated slightly, but Sarah could see her parents' uncertainty. This new arrangement would disrupt the careful boundaries they'd maintained for decades. "We should take it slowly," David suggested. "Maybe monthly dinners? Holiday gatherings when everyone's comfortable." Thomas glanced at his watch. "I should head home. Emma will be waiting to hear how it went." The goodbyes were as awkward as the hellos had been, no one quite sure whether handshakes or hugs were appropriate. Thomas shook hands with David and James, accepted a hesitant hug from Margaret, and gave a small wave to Michael. When he reached Sarah at the door, he paused. "This was all because of you finding that letter," he said quietly. "Thank you for that, for being brave enough to bring it out into the open." "I had to," she replied simply. He nodded. "I know." Then he was gone, walking down the front path to his car parked at the curb. The Wilson family stood in silence as his taillights disappeared around the corner. The house felt different somehow, as if the walls had absorbed the evening's revelations and would never quite be the same. "Well," Margaret said finally, her voice unnaturally bright. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" James gave her an incredulous look. "Mom, we just met the son and brother you and Dad have been hiding from us for our entire lives." "Not so bad isn't exactly the metric I'd use." "He seems nice," Michael offered, always the peacemaker. Sarah said nothing, her mind already racing ahead to what came next. How they would integrate Thomas into their lives after so many years apart. Whether his children would accept them as sudden aunts and uncles. Whether the anger she still felt toward her parents would fade or calcify. Family. It had always seemed like such a simple concept. The people you were born to, the ones who shared your blood and your home. But now she understood it was more complicated than that. Family was also a choice, a daily decision to remain connected despite differences and disappointments. Thomas had made that choice tonight by showing up. Now they all had to decide what happened next. 2 weeks after the dinner, Sarah sat in a busy coffee shop in downtown Hartford, nervously checking her watch. Thomas had suggested they meet halfway between their lives. Not at the Wilson family home laden with decades of memories Thomas hadn't been part of, nor at his home where he held the advantage of familiar territory. Neutral ground seemed appropriate for siblings trying to build a relationship from scratch. The bell above the door jingled, and Sarah looked up to see Thomas entering, shaking rain from his jacket. He spotted her immediately and made his way through the maze of tables. "Sorry I'm late," he said, settling into the chair across from her. Parent-teacher conferences ran long. "No problem. I just got here myself." It was a small lie. She'd arrived 20 minutes early, too anxious to sit at home. They ordered coffee, and an awkward silence fell between them. Sarah had rehearsed dozens of conversation starters on the drive over, but they all evaporated now that Thomas sat across from her. So, she finally managed. How did your wife react to meeting us? Or hearing about us, I mean. Thomas smiled slightly. Emma's known about you all for years. She's been encouraging me to reach out beyond the occasional dinner with David and Margaret. You call them David and Margaret? Sarah asked, surprised. What else would I call them? Thomas shrugged. David is technically my biological father, but John, my mom's husband, raised me. He's dad to me. Sarah nodded, absorbing this perspective she hadn't considered. And our mother? Margaret. She's always been kind to me, Thomas said carefully. But she's not my mother. We both know that. The waitress delivered their coffees, providing a brief respite from the conversation. Sarah stirred sugar into hers, using the moment to gather her thoughts. I've been angry, she admitted. At them, not you. For keeping us apart. For all the years we missed. Thomas considered this as he sipped his coffee. I understand that. I went through something similar when I first found out. But eventually, I realized anger doesn't change anything. It just makes it harder to move forward. That's very zen of you, Sarah said, not entirely keeping the sarcasm from her voice. Not zen. Practical. Thomas set down his cup. Look, I have a good life. I always have. I wasn't deprived of anything growing up. My mother is a wonderful person who made sure I never felt unwanted or unloved. Yes, finding out about David was a shock, but by then I was old enough to process it. But don't you wonder what it would have been like if we'd grown up together? Thomas leaned back in his chair. Sometimes. But then I think about the butterfly effect. If my life had been different, would I have met Emma? Would I have my children? Would I be teaching, which I love? I can't wish away my life just to imagine a different one. Sarah hadn't expected this level of acceptance. You're making me feel childish for being upset. That's not my intention, Thomas said gently. Your experience is completely valid. You found out your parents have been keeping a massive secret your entire life. You have every right to your feelings. They talked for nearly 2 hours, moving from careful politeness to genuine curiosity. Sarah told him about medical school, her brief failed marriage, her current work at the hospital. Thomas shared stories about his students, his passion for literature, his children's recent adventures. Ella has been asking when she gets to meet her new aunt and uncles, he mentioned as they prepared to leave. If you're open to it, maybe you could come to our place for dinner next week? Nothing formal, just pizza and getting acquainted. Sarah agreed immediately, warmth spreading through her at the thought of meeting her niece and nephew. James and Michael would love that too. If they're invited, of course. The whole Wilson sibling crew. As they parted in the parking lot, Sarah impulsively gave Thomas a hug. He stiffened slightly, then returned it with a tentative pat on her back. This is weird, right? She asked, stepping back. Completely weird, he agreed with a small smile. But nice weird, I think. The following Tuesday, the 3 Wilson siblings arrived at Thomas's modest colonial home in West Hartford. Emma, a warm, practical woman with curly auburn hair, greeted them at the door with the ease of someone accustomed to hosting. The kids are beside themselves with excitement, she told them as she took their coats. Especially Ella. She's prepared a full interrogation about being a doctor, Sarah, so consider yourself warned. The house was cozy and lived in, bookshelves overflowing with novels and children's books, a piano covered with sheet music, framed family photos showing Thomas, Emma, and their children in various vacation spots and milestone moments. James paused by one photograph, Thomas and David at what appeared to be Thomas's college graduation. So they really did have a relationship all these years, he murmured to Sarah. A limited one, Sarah whispered back. But yes. A thundering of footsteps announced the children's arrival. Ella, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair, charged into the room first, followed by a more cautious Ben, who immediately sought the safety of his mother's legs. Are you really a doctor who cuts people open? Ella demanded of Sarah without preamble. Sarah laughed, crouching to the girl's level. I'm a pediatrician, which means I take care of children when they're sick. I don't usually cut people open. That's disappointing, Ella said frankly. Ella, Thomas warned, but his tone was light. It's okay, Sarah assured him. Honesty is good, and surgery is pretty cool, Ella. Maybe someday you'll be a surgeon. The evening unfolded with surprising ease. They ate pizza on the back deck, the adults drinking beer while the children had lemonade. Ella warmed to her new uncles quickly, especially when Michael showed her how to program a simple game on his tablet. Ben remained shy, but eventually allowed James to help him build an elaborate Lego structure on the living room floor. After the children were in bed, the adults sat in the backyard, the conversation flowing more naturally than any of them had expected. "I have to ask," Michael said, opening another beer. "Do your kids know the whole story? About how you're related to us?" Thomas and Emma exchanged glances. "We've told Ella a simplified version," Emma explained. "That her daddy found out he had brothers and a sister when he was grown up, and now we're all getting to know each other. She's too young to understand the complexities." "And your mother?" James asked. "Rebecca, how does she feel about all this?" A shadow crossed Thomas's face. "She's been supportive. It was her idea that I meet David when I turned 18. But this new level of connection is challenging for her." "Will we meet her sometime?" Sarah asked. "Maybe eventually," Thomas replied, his tone making it clear the subject was sensitive. The Wilson siblings left just before midnight, the drive back to Westbridge filled with conversation about the evening. They all agreed there was something surreal about gaining a brother and two young family members overnight, but also something undeniably right about it. 2 days later, Sarah received a text from Thomas with a photo attached, a crayon drawing by Ella showing 5 stick figures labeled Daddy, Aunt Sarah, Uncle James, Uncle Michael, and me. The text simply read, "Ella's family portrait from school today. Thought you might like to see it." Sarah stared at the image for a long time, her throat tight with emotion. Such a simple thing, a child's drawing, yet it represented a seismic shift in all their lives. The Wilson family was expanding, redrawing its boundaries to include those who had been kept outside for too long. That night, she called her parents. The conversation was still strained, wounds still fresh, but when she mentioned the dinner at Thomas's house and Ella's drawing, she heard her mother crying softly on the other end of the line. "I'm glad," Margaret whispered. "I'm so glad you're getting to know them." "You could know them too, Mom," Sarah said, surprising herself with the suggestion. "Not right away, but eventually, if Thomas is open to it." "Do you think he would be?" "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that he understands better than any of us how complicated family can be, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it might mean moving forward." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. "I hope so," Margaret finally said. "I really hope so." Autumn arrived in New England with its customary splendor, painting the trees in brilliant reds and golds. 3 months had passed since the revelation that had shaken the Wilson family to its core, and a fragile new normal had begun to emerge. Weekly dinners rotated between homes. Phone calls and text messages flowed with increasing ease, and the initial awkwardness had gradually given way to something resembling genuine family connection. It was at Sunday dinner at James's pristine Westbridge townhouse that the fault lines began to show. Thomas and Emma had brought the children, who were currently engaged in a heated Mario Kart battle with Michael in the living room. The adults gathered in the kitchen, finishing meal preparations. David and Margaret asked if they could join us for Thanksgiving this year. Thomas mentioned casually as he chopped vegetables for the salad. The knife in Sarah's hand stilled. "At your house?" "Yes. Emma and I host every year." He glanced up, noting the sudden tension. It would be the first time they've met Ella and Ben properly. James placed wine glasses on the counter with deliberate care. "And you're okay with that?" "After everything." Thomas shrugged. "They've been asking to be more involved. I think they genuinely want to know their grandchildren." "They're not their grandchildren," Sarah said, more sharply than she intended. "I mean, biologically, yes, but they haven't earned that relationship." An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. Emma busied herself with the oven, pretending not to hear. "Sarah," James murmured in warning. "No, it's fine," Thomas said. "She's entitled to her opinion." He set down the knife. "But they are my children's biological grandparents, and I get to decide what relationship they have with my family." "Of course you do," Sarah backpedaled, hearing how possessive she'd sounded. "I just worry that they're getting off too easily. They lied to us our entire lives, Thomas. They kept you from us. And now we're supposed to just welcome them to Thanksgiving dinner like one big happy family." Thomas wiped his hands on a dishcloth. "No one is saying we should pretend the past didn't happen. But I've had 20 years to process my relationship with David and Margaret. You've had 3 months. We're in different places with this." "Dinner's ready," Emma announced with forced brightness. "I'll get the kids." The meal proceeded with superficial pleasantness, but the undercurrent of tension remained. When Thomas and his family left that evening, the goodbyes were cordial but cool. "You shouldn't have pushed so hard," James told Sarah after they'd gone. "He's right. He gets to decide his own relationship with them." "I know," Sarah sighed, helping to clear the dishes. "I just can't understand how he can be so forgiving. If I were in his position, I'd be furious." "Maybe he was once," Michael suggested, joining them in the kitchen. "But he's had 20 years to work through it. And from what he said, his relationship with Dad has always been pretty limited. It's not like they were playing catch every weekend or something." Sarah scrubbed a plate with unnecessary force. "So we're all just going to pretend everything's fine now? One big happy family for the holidays." "No one's pretending anything," James said firmly. "But holding on to anger doesn't punish Mom and Dad. It just makes it harder to build something new with Thomas and his family." Sarah knew her brothers were right, but the sense of betrayal still burned hot within her. She had always been the one who idealized their family the most, who bragged to friends about her parents' perfect marriage, who believed in the Wilson family mythology. Finding out it had all been built on lies had shaken her foundation in ways her brothers seemed better equipped to handle. The following week, Sarah drove to her parents' house uninvited. She found her mother in the garden, pulling the last of the summer flowers before the first frost. "Sarah," Margaret said, surprised and slightly wary. Their interactions since the revelation had been limited and strained. "Is everything all right? Thomas invited you to Thanksgiving," Sarah said without preamble. Margaret nodded, removing her gardening gloves. "He did. We haven't given him an answer yet. I need to understand something." Sarah sat on the stone bench beside the garden. "How can you just step into their lives now, after all this time? How can you expect to be grandparents to those children when you denied their father a place in our family?" Margaret sighed heavily, joining Sarah on the bench. "We never denied Thomas anything he asked for. When he was 18 and contacted us, David offered him whatever relationship he wanted. Thomas was the one who chose to keep things limited. He had another father he loved, another life." She looked down at her soil-stained hands. "We respected his boundaries. But you never told us about him." "No, we didn't. And that was wrong." Margaret's voice wavered. "We thought we were protecting everyone. You children, Thomas, our family unit. But really, I think we were protecting ourselves from the mess we'd made. It was cowardly." The admission hung in the air between them. "I don't know how to forgive you," Sarah finally said. "I want to. For Thomas's sake, for those children. But every time I think about the years we lost, I know." Margaret reached tentatively for her daughter's hand. "I don't expect forgiveness, Sarah, but I am asking for a chance to do better now. To be honest with all of you. To support whatever relationship you and your brothers want to build with Thomas. To know his children if he'll allow it." The sincerity in her mother's voice made Sarah's eyes sting with unexpected tears. "I don't know if I can sit across a Thanksgiving table from you and act like everything's normal." "Then don't," Margaret said simply. "If Thomas invites us and you're uncomfortable, we won't go. Family holidays aren't worth causing more pain." Sarah hadn't expected that. She'd come prepared for defensiveness, for justifications, not for this quiet acceptance of consequences. "I'll talk to Thomas," she said finally. "It's his Thanksgiving. His decision." When she called Thomas that evening, he listened patiently to her concerns. "I understand," he said when she finished. "And I appreciate your honesty. But Sarah, this isn't just about you and your parents. Or even about me and them. Ella and Ben are part of this equation too." "I know, but let me finish," he said gently. "My children are innocent in all of this. They deserve to know all their family if possible. Not just the parts that are comfortable for the adults involved." Sarah was silent, absorbing his words. "My mother, Rebecca, taught me something important when I was 18, Thomas continued. She said that family is bigger than mistakes or regrets. That I deserve to know my biological father, even if their relationship had ended badly. She set aside her own complicated feelings to give me that choice." "She sounds like an amazing woman," Sarah said quietly. "She is. And someday, I hope you'll meet her." He paused. "I'm not asking you to pretend everything's fine. I'm asking you to consider what kind of future you want for this newly expanded family. One defined by old wounds, or one that acknowledges them but doesn't let them dictate everything that comes after." After they hung up, Sarah sat alone in her apartment for a long time, thinking about family, forgiveness, and the children who were now her niece and nephew. She thought about the little girl who had drawn her into a family portrait after a single meeting, about the shy little boy who had shown her his favorite book before bedtime. 2 days later, she called Thomas back. "I'll be there for Thanksgiving," she said, "if your invitation still stands." "It does," he assured her. "Always. And if David and Margaret come, I'll try. I can't promise more than that." Thomas's voice was warm with understanding. Trying is all anyone can ask, Sarah. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving brought a flurry of text messages between the newly connected siblings. Thomas sent Sarah recipes to prepare, teasing that her medical training hadn't prepared her for proper cranberry sauce. Michael shared ideas for entertaining the children. James, ever practical, coordinated travel arrangements and sleeping accommodations. None of them mentioned the potential presence of David and Margaret, that particular landmine carefully sidestepped in their communications. The night before Thanksgiving, Sarah received a text from her father. "Your mother and I have decided not to attend tomorrow. We don't want to cause tension on Thomas's holiday. We'll see you all another time when everyone is more comfortable. Love you." She read it twice, feeling a complex mixture of relief and something that might have been disappointment. She forwarded it to Thomas with a simple message, "I'm sorry." His reply came minutes later. "Their choice. They're trying to. See you tomorrow." Sarah packed her overnight bag for the trip to Hartford, wondering how family gatherings had suddenly become so complicated and emotionally charged. The Wilsons had always done holidays with military precision and surface perfection. This messy, evolving, complicated version of family was entirely new territory. And yet, as she zipped her bag closed, she realized she was looking forward to tomorrow, to seeing Thomas and his family, to being an aunt, to the chance to build something new from the wreckage of long-held secrets. It wouldn't be perfect, but perhaps it could be real in a way the Wilson family gatherings had never been before. Thanksgiving at Thomas's house was nothing like the Wilson family celebrations Sarah had grown up with, where Margaret had always insisted on formal place settings and meticulous decorations. Emma had placed mismatched plates on a table covered with a cheerful red tablecloth. Crayon drawings of turkeys served as placemats. Children's laughter echoed through the house as Ella showed her uncles her collection of rocks and feathers, while Ben quietly built a tower of blocks in the corner, occasionally glancing up to check that his new relatives were still there. Sarah found herself in the kitchen with Emma, mashing potatoes while Thomas basted the turkey. "I'm sorry about David and Margaret not coming," Emma said, keeping her voice low. "It's probably for the best," Sarah replied. "This is already a lot." Emma nodded, understanding in her eyes. Family is always complicated, even without the soap opera elements. Sarah smiled despite herself. "That's an understatement. Can I ask you something?" Emma set down the masher and turned to face Sarah directly. "Why is this so much harder for you than for your brothers? Thomas has mentioned that you seem to be struggling the most with all of this." The question caught Sarah off guard. She glanced toward the living room to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I guess because I believed in the myth the most," she finally said. "James was always the skeptic, and Michael goes with the flow. But I was the one who thought our family was perfect. Finding out it was all built on lies I don't know. It broke something in me." Emma's expression softened. "It wasn't all built on lies. From what Thomas tells me, your parents truly love each other and you kids. One mistake, albeit a massive one, doesn't erase everything else." "But how do I trust anything now?" Sarah whispered. If they could hide something this huge, what else might not be true? Before Emma could respond, Ella burst into the kitchen. "Aunt Sarah, Uncle James says you have to settle an argument about whether hippos are more dangerous than lions." Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "That's quite the Thanksgiving debate. What do you think, Ella?" "Hippos, obviously," the little girl stated with complete confidence. "Uncle James agrees with me, but Uncle Michael says I'm wrong." "Then we'd better go educate Uncle Michael," Sarah said, grateful for the interruption. The meal itself was chaotic and warm. Side dishes were passed around with minimal ceremony. Wine was poured into everyday glasses, and the conversation flowed easily between serious topics and silly ones. By the time they reached dessert, 3 different pies because everyone had a favorite, Sarah felt something in her chest loosening, a tightness she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. After the children were in bed, the adults gathered in the living room with coffee and leftover pie. James had just finished telling a story about one of his more eccentric clients when Thomas cleared his throat. "There's something I want to share with all of you," he said, his expression serious. My mother, Rebecca, would like to meet you, if you're open to it." The room fell silent. This was territory they hadn't ventured into yet. Rebecca Baker remained a shadowy figure in their newly expanded family narrative, the woman who had a brief affair with David Wilson and raised their half-brother alone. "She's coming for Christmas," Thomas continued into the silence. "Just for a day or two. She lives in Arizona now, with her second husband. But she thinks it's time." Sarah exchanged glances with her brothers. This wasn't something they had discussed or anticipated. "I'd like to meet her," Michael said first, always the most adaptable of the siblings. James nodded slowly. "Yes, I think that would be appropriate. Important, even." All eyes turned to Sarah. She took a deep breath. "Would it be weird if I said I've been curious about her from the beginning? About the woman who—" She trailed off, unsure how to phrase it delicately. "About the woman who had an affair with your father?" Thomas finished for her, his tone gentle rather than accusatory. "It's not weird. And for what it's worth, she's been curious about all of you too." "Then yes," Sarah decided. "I'd like to meet her." The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas passed in a blur of hospital shifts for Sarah. The pediatric ward was always busiest during winter, filled with flu cases and holiday accidents. She welcomed the distraction, finding it easier to focus on sick children than on her still-evolving feelings about her family. She spoke with her parents only once during this period, a brief, stilted phone call on her father's birthday. The gap between them felt both wide and somehow less significant than before. The white-hot anger had cooled to something more manageable, a dull ache rather than an acute pain. 2 days before Christmas, Thomas texted the siblings, "Mom arrived today. Dinner at our place tomorrow night at 7? No pressure, but she'd love to meet you all." Sarah stared at the message for a long time before replying with a simple, "I'll be there." The following evening, she arrived at Thomas's house precisely at 7, having changed her outfit 3 times and rehearsed potential conversations in her head throughout the drive. James was already there, standing awkwardly in the living room with a glass of wine. Michael texted that he was running late, typical Michael. "She's in the kitchen with Thomas and Emma," James murmured as Sarah hung up her coat. "She seems nice." Sarah nodded, smoothing her sweater nervously before following James toward the kitchen. Nothing could have prepared her for the woman she met there. Rebecca Baker was not at all what Sarah had imagined. In her mind, she'd pictured someone flashy and dramatic, the kind of woman who would have an affair with a married man. Instead, she found a slender woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a simple bun, laugh lines around her eyes, and an air of quiet dignity. "Sarah," Rebecca said, stepping forward with a gentle smile. "Thomas has told me so much about you." Sarah accepted the older woman's extended hand, noting the simple silver wedding band, the practical manicure, the intelligent eyes that studied her carefully. "It's nice to meet you," Sarah managed, surprised to find she meant it. Dinner was less awkward than Sarah had feared. Rebecca proved to be thoughtful and articulate, sharing stories about Thomas's childhood that made them all laugh. She spoke of her life in Arizona with her husband of 20 years, their work with a literacy program on the Navajo reservation, their shared passion for photography. It wasn't until after the meal, when Thomas and Emma were putting the children to bed and Michael was helping with dishes, that Sarah found herself alone with Rebecca on the back porch. They stood side by side, breath fogging in the cold air, watching the stars emerge in the winter sky. "I know this is strange for you," Rebecca said quietly. "Meeting the woman who complicated your family story so dramatically." Sarah wrapped her hands around her mug of tea. "It's not what I expected. Meeting me, or the whole situation? Both, I guess." Sarah hesitated, then decided directness was the only approach that made sense. "Can I ask you something? Why did you tell Thomas about David when he turned 18? You could have kept the secret. He had your husband as a father. Why complicate his life?" Rebecca considered the question, seeming to appreciate Sarah's candor rather than taking offense. "Because secrets have power," she finally said. "As long as Thomas didn't know, the truth had power over him, over all of us. I wanted him to have the choice that had been taken from him as a child, whether to know his biological father or not, whether to have siblings or not. That was his right." The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. Choice. The very thing her parents had taken from all of them by maintaining their decades-long deception. "I don't hate your father," Rebecca continued, her voice soft but clear in the cold air. What happened between us was complicated. We were both responsible. And in the end, I got Thomas, which makes any pain or regret worthwhile. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Your parents made a mistake in how they handled the situation, Rebecca said. A significant one. But I hope you'll find a way to forgive them eventually, for your own sake as much as theirs. I'm trying, Sarah admitted. It's just, they were supposed to be the perfect ones. The ones who did everything right. Rebecca smiled sadly. Perfect people don't exist, Sarah. Only real ones. They stood in companionable silence for several minutes, watching their breath cloud and dissipate in the frosty air. From inside, they could hear laughter as Michael apparently said something amusing. He seems like a good man, Rebecca said. Thomas, from what I can see, you've all turned out to be good people, despite the complications and secrets. He is, Sarah agreed. I wish I'd known him my whole life. But you know him now, Rebecca pointed out. That's something worth cherishing. When the evening ended, Sarah hugged Rebecca goodbye without hesitation. It was strange to feel such warmth toward this woman who had once been cast in her mind as the villain of the piece. But life, she was learning, rarely provided such clear-cut roles. Christmas Day found Sarah at her parents' house for the first time since the revelation. It had been Thomas who suggested it. A brief morning visit before they all gathered at his house in the afternoon. For the children, he had said, so they can have all their family in their lives. The Wilson family home was decorated as meticulously as ever, the tree perfectly trimmed, the mantel adorned with the same stockings they'd had since childhood. But something was different. The perfection felt more fragile somehow, more human. Margaret hugged Sarah tightly when she arrived, holding on a moment too long. David stood awkwardly nearby, relief evident in his face when Sarah didn't pull away. I brought cinnamon rolls, Sarah said, holding up the bakery box. Thomas mentioned they're Ella's favorite. They are, David confirmed, helping her with her coat. She made us promise to bring some when we visited last week. Sarah paused, surprised. You've been to their house? Margaret nodded. Just for an hour. To drop off some presents for the children. Thomas thought it would be good for them to see us before today. And Rebecca? Did you see her too? Her parents exchanged glances. Briefly, David admitted. It was civil. Sarah tried to imagine that meeting. Her father face to face with his former lover, her mother in the same room as the woman her husband had betrayed her with. The complexity of it made her head spin. We're trying, Sarah, Margaret said softly. All of us are trying to find a way forward. Sarah looked at her parents, older now, more vulnerable than she had ever seen them. The perfect Wilson family image had been shattered beyond repair. But perhaps what was emerging from the fragments was something more valuable. A family built on truth rather than appearances, on forgiveness rather than perfection. I know, she said, reaching for her mother's hand. I'm trying.